It's February 23rd, 1945. We're on Iwo Jima. Marine Corporal Herschel Woody Williams awaits his orders. In front of him, enemy pillboxes rise like stubby teeth out of the black volcanic dust. They cover the Marines' primary objective, Airfield No. 2. Behind him, his comrades are dying in their dozens beneath withering Japanese fire. Their advance inland is faltering. The shallow shell hole offers scant cover. Bullets whiz by, screaming through the air, far too close for comfort. William knows what has to happen. These pillboxes of reinforced concrete, bristling with machine guns, are what's stopping the advance. They must be cleared, and they must fall. He knows it's up to him, but he needs to hear the orders from his commander. The officer has to yell to make himself heard above the roar of battle. You're the only flamethrower and demolition expert left. Can you do something about those pillboxes? William's response is succinct. He merely says, "I'll try." In a flash, Williams is out of the shell hole and scurrying across the patch of ground to the first pillbox. The 32-kilo flamethrower weighs heavily on his 5-foot 6-inch frame. The dust chokes his lungs and stings his eyes. The ground collapses beneath his feet, slowing him down. 4 Marine riflemen cover his advance, but their efforts are just like spitting into the face of a whirlwind as a hail of small arms fire comes back the other way. From somewhere behind him, Williams hears an anguished scream as another one of his friends is struck. Cresting a slight rise, Williams finds himself disoriented. The tremors of the battle cast black dust into the air. Smoke hangs thickly above the ground, and visibility is dangerously low. But scanning the terrain, he sees what he needs to see, a small pipe poking up from the soil. It's the pillbox's ventilation duct. This is his opening. William squeezes the triggers on the device strapped across his shoulders. A thick, acrid scent of gasoline and diesel fills the air as the nitrogen propellant forces the mixture out of the tanks and into the nozzle of the lance he carries. Then a searing, scorching rush as the white phosphorus in the nozzle ignites the jet. For a moment, Williams is illuminated by the blinding flash, becoming a human Roman candle, raining his deadly fire down into the bunker. In Williams' own words, "They didn't give us any trouble after that." But that's just one pillbox. There are plenty more to go. For 4 hours, Williams fights his way back and forth through the defences around the airfield. He returns again and again to refuel. When his equipment gives out, he switches it for another. He will go through 6 of these devices before the day is out. When his body threatens to give out, he catches a few seconds of breath before dashing back into the breach once again. Exhausted now, and hours into his fight, Williams is still going, but spraying the pillboxes with flame means getting in at close quarters. His effective range is only 15 meters. At this distance, the slightest mistake would be fatal. Finally, an almost spent Williams makes that mistake. He's lost count of how many pillboxes he's knocked out by now, but on this approach, his advance is too quick. He's suddenly aware of enemy soldiers flooding out of the position, their bayonets drawn. They'll outflank him, surely. Williams thinks it's all over, unless he can do something to get the drop on them. And he manages it. Squeezing his 2 triggers, he unleashes a devastating jet of flame onto his attackers. He would later remember how the force of the blast seemed to slow them as they charged, before they collapsed into blazing heaps on the floor. For his actions at the airfield, Herschel Williams will win the Medal of Honor. Thinking back to that afternoon of blood and fire, Williams will later say, "Much of the battle is just a blank. I have no memory of it." But to even have the opportunity to think back to the battle at all makes Williams one of the lucky ones. The 21-year-old from quiet Dell, West Virginia, would survive Iwo Jima. 6,821 of his fellow Americans, and perhaps more than 18,000 Japanese, would not. They would lose their lives in the 5-week-long fight. Just living through Iwo Jima was an impressive feat, but surviving it with a flamethrower strapped to your back, that was something else. Reports vary on just how many flamethrowers were deployed on Iwo Jima. The number is probably between 335 and 380. When victory was secured on March 26, 1945, only 18 of those soldiers remained. The rest, between 92 and 94%, died on the island. Surely one of the most astonishing death rates for any fighting force in history. So why was this? Why did so many flamethrower operators lose their lives on Iwo Jima? Perhaps the most obvious reason is the nature of the weapon itself. The concept of the flamethrower is thousands of years old. The Boeotians may have harnessed the physically destructive and psychologically damaging power of the flamethrower as early as the 5th century BC, and Byzantium was certainly using this type of weapon by the 7th century AD. But on Iwo Jima, we're talking about something much more specific than just harnessing the power of flames. We're talking about the M2 flamethrower. This was a portable device designed to deliver a highly mobile, highly destructive jet of fire into whatever enemy stood in its way. The device featured a collection of 3 tanks. The 2 large tanks were filled with a thick mixture of petroleum and diesel, and the 1 small tank was filled with the nitrogen propellant. The tanks were welded to a rigid metal frame and slung over the operator's back with 2 canvas straps. The mixture was fed into a length of hose around 1 meter long, which connected to the lance, essentially the gun of the flamethrower. The lance had 2 triggers. The one nearest the hose activated the propellant tank, driving the flammable liquid out of the weapon at high speed. The trigger on the front of the lance set off the flare cartridge. This ignited the liquid as it flew through the air. The viscous mixture of petrol and diesel was certainly flammable, but in a pressurized container like the tank strapped to the operator's back, it was also highly explosive. If you got the chance to see an M2 up close, you'll notice that it seems like a pretty robust piece of kit. The sturdy construction can certainly withstand being thrown around or dropped on the floor. All of this is crucial for something designed to be deployed in the field. Williams would even describe his own flamethrower as virtually bulletproof, but this part was only partially true. The sturdy design could withstand a hit from a machine gun or rifle, particularly a glancing blow on the curved surface. It may even survive a direct hit, but this didn't mean that they were immune to gunfire. A bullet strike could cause a rupture in the tank or in the hose, which could lead to a secondary explosion. Even the compressed nitrogen propellant could explode if the tank was damaged by a bullet or grenade, and there were plenty of these bullets and grenades flying around on Iwo Jima. The story of Herschel Williams also presents us with another factor that made the life of a flamethrower operator so perilous, and this was the way in which these soldiers were deployed. It's hard to support a flamethrower as a Marine Corps rifleman. You can't stand too close to him because if he gets hit, the explosion is going to take you out too. You can't even fire too close to him. The slightest miscalculation and your covering fire could be the shot that kills your comrade. So flamethrower units often found themselves advancing almost alone, and they had a lot of ground to cover. The Imperial War Museum describes the range of their own M2 as about 45 meters or close to 150 feet. But flamethrower operators couldn't just stand off at maximum range and spray their enemy with fire. These weapons burned through fuel at a rate of around half a gallon every second. An imprecise flamethrower operator would quickly find himself out of fuel and basically defenseless. Also, the M2 wasn't designed for continuous operation. All that fire would have generated a lot of heat, which was kind of the point of the weapon, and such extreme heat tends to damage military equipment. This meant that flamethrowers were only really effective in short bursts. In fact, short bursts were how all rapid-fire weapons were used in the Second World War. Flamethrower operators couldn't stand there for minutes on end laying down carpets of flame across a wide area, just like machine gun operators couldn't simply rake their enemies with continuous fire. This is fantasy, it's Hollywood movie stuff. The weapons would simply get too hot and then they'd malfunction. A malfunction could mean a jam in the case of a machine gun, or something much more catastrophic for a flamethrower. So, soldiers needed to pick their spot and select their targets well. Once they unleashed that burst of flame, they'd need to make it count. Williams reckoned his own effective range to be about 15 metres, roughly a third of the maximum range of the M2. So they'd need to get in fairly close to their targets, which meant they had to be agile and manoeuvrable too. And this isn't easy with a flamethrower on your back. Returning to the Imperial War Museum's own M2, the device weighs just under 15 kilograms when empty, but reports from veterans like Herschel Williams suggest their own units may have weighed more than double this when filled. This would have been a serious proposition for a soldier carrying one of them. Imagine sprinting across rough terrain with a rucksack on your back filled with 30 kilos of bricks. Then imagine you're getting shot at the same time. And then imagine that those bricks you're carrying are very explosive. There's also the problem of training. Herschel Williams served as a demolition specialist, but he'd never seen a flamethrower before 1944. When the mysterious weapon was delivered to his unit, he essentially had to learn to use it himself. By the time he arrived on Iwo Jima less than a year later, he was a senior operator. He supervised 6 other operators as part of his special weapons unit, despite not being particularly experienced himself. While Williams and his comrades were undoubtedly skilled, this lack of formal training would have put many flamethrower operators in harm's way when they were let loose on Iwo Jima. All of this begs the question, what was it in aid of? If flamethrowers were so vulnerable, why deploy them at all? Well, the reason for this is simple. They were very effective, and the Marine Corps needed them. Corporal Raymond Hart came ashore with the Marines on February 19, 1945. He remembered meeting little resistance on that first landing, but the situation quickly changed as they advanced inland. On the second day, they came up against a thick line of concrete and steel. The reinforced pillboxes were well positioned, and interlocking fields of fire kept Hart and his comrades pinned down. With no way through, they needed a different approach and different weapons. In short, flamethrowers, as Hart himself recalled. It was the flamethrowers that got it done on Iwo Jima. But this effectiveness brings up another factor that made the life of a flamethrower so precarious. As he prepared to defend Iwo Jima against the coming onslaught, the island's commander, Lieutenant Tadamichi Kurebayashi, made a very deliberate decision. This decision was defense in depth. Rather than stop the amphibious forces at the beaches, Kurebayashi would offer only scant resistance at the shoreline. Once the Americans had landed, then he would lure them into the trap. While the Japanese position was not great, the geography of the island was to their advantage. The towering peak of Suribachi dominated the southwestern tip of the island, with its walls of dark andesite rock looming more than 160 metres into the sky. The rest of the island was a rocky plateau. This was flatter, but it was riddled with caves and passages that favoured the defender. On this favourable ground, the Japanese had dug in well. Networks of pillboxes and defensive trenches crisscrossed the land. These were the defences that stood in the way of the Americans, and they were manned by an enemy who was prepared to fight until the very end. This is where flamethrowers and demolition squads came into play. These weapons were ideal for taking out well-fortified pillboxes. A quick blast of flame through any opening would incinerate the men within. The flames could even suck the air out of the space, suffocating anyone who escaped the initial blast. Demolition specialists, armed with charges, could blow the top off of a pillbox, killing anyone inside and leaving the way clear for armour and men to advance. These were brutal tactics, but the alternative was suicide. Wave after wave of frontal infantry assault would be cut down by the machine gunners in the pillboxes. A pillbox could simply soak up the American assault. Entire platoons would be bogged down by one of these emplacements and then picked off one by one or simply mown down en masse. But just a single flamethrower operator could punch a hole in the line. And the thing is, the Japanese also understood this. They knew all about flamethrower units. They used them themselves. The Type 93 flamethrower had been in deployment since the invasion of Manchuria in 1933, so the Imperial troops knew firsthand how devastating these things could be. So the M2 flamethrowers and the men operating them became key targets for the Japanese. The defenders of Iwo Jima knew that most Marine squads had a flamethrower attached to it, so these were the soldiers they'd aim to kill first. And spotting a flamethrower was easy. The shape and profile of these soldiers and the way they move across the terrain are distinctive. They are visibly very different to their comrades, and the enormous arc of flame emitting from a flamethrower is less than inconspicuous. Even in the smoke, heat, and terror of battle, these kinds of pyrotechnics get noticed fast. Many flamethrower operators found they managed to pull off the perfect shot, only to be hit by a hail of bullets from every direction once the enemy sighted them. This has given rise to an often quoted figure regarding the flamethrowers on Iwo Jima, that their average lifespan was between 4 and 10 minutes during the battle. This is perhaps a little misleading. Most men would have spent days or weeks on Iwo Jima, but once they'd strapped the equipment to their backs and engaged the enemy, that clock would have certainly started ticking down, and a few minutes is probably not far from the truth for these highly visible, highly vulnerable targets. The assault on Iwo Jima is famous for its sickening loss of life, but even with the win-at-all-costs doctrine of the island-hopping campaign, a 92 or perhaps even 94% death rate is just not acceptable. So the Americans modified their approach. Once the conditions of battle became favourable, they deployed the flame tank. Flame tanks had been used before, with varying levels of effectiveness, and the modified M4A3 Sherman tanks solved many of the problems of Iwo Jima. Known as Ronsons, or Zippos, after the famous cigarette lighter brands, these medium tanks carried a flamethrower in place of their main gun. They had a longer range than an individual flamethrower operator, and were much harder for the Japanese to take out. They weren't so well suited to the mountainous terrain of Suribachi, but once the mountain had been taken, these vehicles were well equipped to traverse the flat plateau covering the rest of the island. As the battle raged for another 4 weeks after Suribachi fell, flame tanks were critical to the eventual victory on Iwo Jima. They were also terrifying to behold. A single soldier spraying fire from his M2 would have been unsettling, to say the least, but battle-hardened Japanese troops did know that a lucky shot would slay one of these soldiers wherever he stood. Flame tanks, on the other hand, were different. It's true that Japan's military culture made surrender unlikely, and this is proven by their casualty figures. Only 1,000 of the 21,000-strong garrison were taken prisoner at the end of the battle. But these Japanese soldiers weren't robots. They were still human beings. And when they saw a clanking behemoth, like the Sherman, suddenly spraying fire from its turret like some mythical beast, many of them simply turned and fled. Whether it was mounted on an M4 Sherman or strapped to the back of an individual Marine, the flamethrower made a huge contribution to the eventual victory. Of course, the actual strategic value of this victory has been disputed over the years. The assault on Iwo Jima was part of the island-hopping strategy favoured by Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. This involved massive amphibious assaults designed to overwhelm an enemy position, resulting in enormous casualties for both sides. The Americans had used this strategy before. At Tarawa in 1943, more than 1,000 Americans died. At Peleliu and Saipan in 1944, 2,000 and 3,000 would lose their lives. Now, at Iwo Jima, they'd do it again, and 6,821 Americans would die. Some argue that Iwo Jima became a valuable asset in the remaining months of the war. More than 2,250 B-29s would land on the island after its capture, and thousands of fighter planes flew missions from its airfields. However, the true value of these missions is again disputed. Others say that the Americans had no choice. They couldn't have just ignored Iwo Jima. This would have left the fleet open to air attack from Japanese planes stationed there. A third viewpoint is that any strategic importance the island did have was almost certainly not worth the grim cost of taking it. A lot of these views have been hotly debated by historians and experts over the years. But none of this would have mattered to the men down there on the island doing the fighting. For them, the task was simple: win the battle, win the war, go home. And that's what they did, with the help of Herschel Williams' flamethrower and the 300 or so others who put themselves at enormous risk to achieve victory. On April 1st, 1945, just 5 days after the victory was declared on Iwo Jima, Nimitz and the 10th Army were gearing up to do it all over again with another daring amphibious assault. This time, the venue was Okinawa. And before that island fell, nearly 3 months later, 12,500 Americans, 119 British sailors, and almost 95,000 Japanese would have to die.